Hey everybody, welcome to Swedenborgian Life, and today it's our very special Swedenborg Influence Trivia Game Show. I can just imagine some kids like, oh, this is the game show? Yes, that is what we are going to do today. I'm Curtis Childs, and I'll be your host. With me, as always, is Dr. Jonathan Rose. Thanks so much for hanging out.
Hey, Curtis. Thanks for having me.
And if you've been following our show throughout the weeks and feel like giving us a like and subscribe, don't forget to do that. That seriously helps us on YouTube. And what's good for us on YouTube is good for us on YouTube. So thank you so much for considering it. And we're following up, as we always do, we're following up from previous show. Just kidding. There's no previous show. Today is like, we never do this, but it's a standalone live show. And to further weird everybody out, there's no icebreaker, but there is a participation element. We are going to be playing the Swedenborg's Influence Trivia Game Show. I keep saying trivia in there. You don't need that in there. The Swedenborg's Influence Game Show. And we are going to be unveiling these people that Swedenborg has influenced, that you may not know who they are or that he influenced them. But if you can guess them in the chat room before they come up, you get a point every time you do. If you let the person know what it is before the person pops on the screen, you get a point. At the end of the show, whoever has the most points, we will announce the winner, maybe, if anybody plays, on this program. So we're talking today about Swedenborg's influence, and there's a lot of good reasons to do that. Mm-hmm. I think many people have wondered, find Swedenborg and think he's cool, so why have I never heard of Swedenborg in the first place? I mean, that's a question that comes up if he's really legit, you know?
How valuable could something be if you never heard that name? You know, shouldn't people be talking about this? What's going on?
That's right. So, so what happened there? In the 1900s, he kind of dropped out, right?
Yeah, that's right. But in the 1800s, he was very well known. He published a lot of his works in London. And in Europe and in the New World, in America, he was very well known, especially the second half of the 19th century.
Yeah, it was tripping me out. I remember I searched these old newspapers, and you would find like, so-and-so's new thing smacks of Swedenborgianism. Like that was just a word you'd see in newspapers back then.
Right.
But even in that time period, when it was all out there, there was these prominent culture shapers influenced by his books.
That's right, and his name didn't always, it's like a tag on a shirt or something, you know, the name didn't always stay attached as the ideas spread around. So some people thought, oh, this is great, and then they start a new religious movement, but there's no particular incentive to say, well, this came from Swedenborg, you know?
That's right.
So we call it something different. So some of the ideas are much more widespread than the name. So there's more influence than it looks like.
And we wanted to do this show for a couple of reasons, to answer that question, but then also to show that it's not just this weird, fuddly corner of the internet where we're going on and on about Swedenborg. that there was, and what we want to show in this episode is, as you were mentioning before, just the broad swath of the different aspects of human society he's influenced.
Yeah, that's right. His influence, you can imagine someone being influential, but it's just a certain type of people, you know, who embrace it. And it's just, okay, that's that type of person. But that's not the case with Swedenborg. The people who lit up about it seem to be all over the map.
And just where do they reside on that map? Well, we're going to take a look at it now in part 2. So as we were just saying, Swedenborg's concepts affected influential people in many categories and influenced them in different ways.
That's right. That's right. And some people have held his books, like you could sort of divide it into two grand categories, I would say. Okay. Some people have held his books as like, this is my spiritual home. This is, you know, this is what I've been looking for my whole life.
It would not be us.
And other people were just like, this is a fascinating stepping stone. I got this idea and that idea. Oh, and look at that. That looks good too. And you know, they're moving along, and they're both ways that people do it. Some people just have a very academic interest because they're looking into the history of ideas, and that's what they see in there. So.
All right, so we're going to start off our trivia game. Remember, you play along, answer your guesses in the chat as it comes up. Here's our first clue. Can we learn by these sets of 3 clues who this person is before their face pops up? I was an American essayist, lecturer, philosopher, and poet who led the transcendentalist movement of the mid-19th century. Well, I mean, who didn't? All right, that's no big.
That's right.
Okay, let's see what they got next. I developed philosophies about individuality, freedom, the ability for mankind to realize almost anything, and the relationship between the soul and the surrounding world. Is that narrowing it down for you? I still don't feel like I know it. Okay, next one. My work greatly influenced the thinkers, writers, and poets that followed me. So who is this person? I don't know if you've guessed it yet in the chat, but it was none other than Ralph Waldo Emerson. Come on, you've heard that. People have probably heard that name. And this is, little do most people know that he was heavily influenced by Swedenborg. This is a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, I believe. Yes, and he calls Swedenborg a colossal soul. Swedenborg lies vast abroad on his times, uncomprehended by them, and requires a long focal distance to be seen. Which is just an amazing quote, and so, like, that is the Swedenborg phenomenon. So Emerson spoke and wrote on a lot of topics, right?
That's right. He wrote about freedom, about kindness, integrity, service, individual potential and growth, things that are cutting edge ideas at that time.
And certainly big in Swedenborg's canon of
that's right,
of focus.
Yeah, you can see where he got it.
Yeah, and then he also talks extensively about nature, and to get some of the nitty-gritty of how Swedenborg potentially influenced him on that, we are going to go to a guest video from Dr. Devin Zuber, who is a good friend of the show, and he's an associate professor of American Studies, Religion, and Literature at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and he has a special interest in environmentalism, and here's what he had to say about Emerson and Swedenborg.
So it's hard to overstate the powerful influence Emerson wielded as a cultural critic. In some ways, he's like the Oprah Winfrey of the 19th century after the Civil War, enormously influential. And in his debut text, which is called Nature in 1836, there are a sequence of chapters that sort of go through his idealist sense of what nature's about. And it's particularly in the chapter called Language, where you see Emerson clearly telegraphing his reading of Swedenborgian texts, even to the point where there's almost a word-to-word correlation to a Swedenborgian French text that he had encountered on the side. So it's early on in Emerson's first inaugural debut that sort of launches the Transcendentalist movement in 1836, and Swedenborg remains a consistent center of Emerson's intellectual orbit. And today, when we want to sort of think about the roots of American environmentalism and the greening of American thought, it's really in that circle in Concord, Massachusetts. That's not just Emerson, but also includes Henry David Thoreau, that's sort of seen as embodying a new approach towards nature as this spiritual space. And not just correspondence, influx is also a central term for Emerson that comes out of his reading in Swedenborg. In fact, Emerson's first encounter with Swedenborgian ideas might have been in his father's library as a young boy, because his dad, who was also a Unitarian minister, had an early rare copy of Swedenborg's Relation Between the Soul and the Body, which was translated into English as a theosophical lucubration on the nature of influx. So there was, one could say, there was, the word influx is perhaps the first association Emerson comes to have with Swedenborg. Emerson reads books by or about Swedenborg throughout his life. There's over 30 volumes in his library, many of them heavily annotated. So, and it's important to say too that Emerson also had strong reservations about Swedenborg and had critiques, which he puts into his famous essay on Representative Men on the Mystic. But to the end, Swedenborg is a perennial author for him. A key mediator for Emerson's understanding of correspondence and influx is a guy named Samson Reed, who today most people have never heard of, but he was a really critical early Swedenborgian New Church figure in Boston, who, because of the small infant size of the Swedenborgian New Church movement, even though he went to Harvard Divinity School, he couldn't get a job as a preacher. So he ends up becoming a homeopathic physician and writes books on the side that sort of distill Swedenborgian concepts like correspondence and influx. And Emerson is really enamored with a book called Observations on the Growth of the Mind, which appears in 1826. And in many ways, Reid's argument that because nature doesn't have classical symmetry with parallelism and right angles, and if our art is to correspond with the presence of the divine in nature, we need to have sort of wild, unruled art forms. It's an argument for free verse poetics that substantially pre-anticipates the work of Walt Whitman later on, The Leaves of Grass.
So there you have in Emerson, Swedenborg's influence on a thinker and a culture shaper, but also in this environmentalist vein.
That's right, and he comes out of the Christian tradition and that kind of thing, and yeah, that's a very interesting one.
So there's a box we can check off. Swedenborg can influence that part of life. Let's see if we can't just shift categories to something totally different for our second person influenced by Swedenborg. So we got our clues list. I was a Japanese author on Buddhism, and I was instrumental in spreading ideas of Zen and Shin Buddhism in the Western world. Yeah, no, nothing. Let's go to the next one. I was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1963. Do you know who it was? Yeah, I've got all the 70s memorized.
62, 64, I can think of it.
So next, finally, I described Swedenborg as the Buddha of the North. That's a pretty strong description. And so who are you? This name may not jump out at everybody, but this was none other than the well-respected D.T. Suzuki. And this is a quote from his book about Sweden, in the preface to his book about Swedenborg. Revolutionary in theology, traveler of heaven and hell, champion of the spiritual world, king of the mystical realm, clairvoyant in history, scholar of uncomparable vigor, scientist of penetrating intellect, gentleman free of worldly taint, all of these combined into one make Swedenborg. I know we were joking that that's like a Swedenborg-sized sentence to start off.
Yeah, right.
Now, in Japan, the field of religious thought is finally reaching a state of crisis. Those who wish to cultivate their spirit, those who bemoan the times, must absolutely know of this person. So it sounds like he was pretty into Swedenborg. So what was up with him, and what was he doing?
Yeah, he was very interested in Swedenborg. Later, as his life evolved, he focused more on Zen Buddhism and wrote less about Swedenborg. But he found in Swedenborg a Western theologian, this very unusual thing to find a Christian Bible sort of kind of guy who nevertheless had ideas that were very compatible with this Eastern spirituality. And so he was quite an influential bridge figure, Suzuki was, making this connection through Swedenborg.
Amazing. Okay, so there we get into religious philosophy, which is where you'd think Swedenborg would be, but maybe not as far,
as far afield.
As far east as that. And so let's see if we can't add another feather in the cap here. Do you want to take this next round of clues?
Oh, sure. All right. Who am I? I overcame the limitations of severe physical disabilities.
All right. Well, good start.
I dedicated my life to finding ways to relieve suffering and inspire people with hope.
It doesn't sound so bad.
Okay. I fought to raise awareness of the plight of the disabled and to set up methods by which they could reach their potential as contributing members of society. Who am I?
Anybody in the chat?
You get this one, people?
All right, let's take a look.
Who is that? Helen Keller.
Bam.
Yes, and she actually wrote a whole book about Swedenborg, and I think we have a quote here. Swedenborg's message has meant so much to me. It has given color and reality and unity to my thought of the life to come. It has exalted my ideas of love, truth, and usefulness. It has been my strongest incitement to overcome limitations. If you are not aware of this, she was at an early age she was deaf and blind and couldn't speak. Yeah. And was basically, for most of her childhood, like a feral child, you know? And she came out of that and embraced Swedenborg, again, in a lifelong way. It was very important to her.
Such a striking quote from her there, because her ability, saying that Swedenborg was the thing that enabled her to overcome limitations, because her overcoming limitations and the way she then made that a bridge for other people to do so, that's what she's known for.
Epic. How many people can you say, oh yeah, that person really totally, I mean, she's top of the list of people who've overcome, horrendous problems like that.
Yeah, and one of the more famous, I think, heavily influenced by Swedenborg people, she actually wrote a book called How I Would Help the World, as you mentioned, which was all about Swedenborg. She was like saying, hey, let me talk about Swedenborg, and the people close to her were more saying, keep that under wraps, it's the weird Swedenborg stuff, you just go change society.
Yeah.
But the message, I think, that resonated from her, to even people that don't have disabilities, is that people are more than their physical conditions.
Yeah.
Life is more than physical life.
That's right. You're not defined by your blindness or your deafness or whatever it is.
And that you can always, no matter what, find a way to serve others and be useful. And this being a core Swedenborgian tenet is we're all created to have our own bit of usefulness there. So there's a major influence Swedenborg had, and it's not just in passing. She herself admitted it over and over.
Yeah,
Swedenborg
she
is
flew
cool.
around the world as an activist, just doing things she really was a game changer for people with all kinds of disabilities.
So there we, and in a totally separate category from these ones that we've had
That's
before
right.
in this show. Let's take a look and see if we can't add another category here with number 4. So, I don't know how you're doing on the quiz, but maybe you'll get this one. You have to know your history pretty well.
Yeah.
I was an American architect and urban designer and director of the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893.
Okay.
Which I feel like was one of the more famous World's Fairs. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, I think
Not
so.
a bluff. I took a leading role in creating plans for the development of a number of cities and also designed famous buildings. So this person's name is probably still around on some of these buildings, okay? I co-authored the Plan of Chicago, the first comprehensive plan for the controlled growth of an American city and an outgrowth of the City Beautiful movement. The plan declared that every citizen should be within walking distance of a park. Maybe if you live in Chicago, you would know this better than others. His name is, in case you didn't guess it yet, Daniel Burnham.
Yes.
And he did all those things we just talked about, and he had this to say this was from a biography about him. Burnham was born in Henderson, New York, and raised in the teachings of the Swedenborgians called the New Church, which ingrained in him the strong belief that man should strive to be of service to others. And so what was Burnham, besides building and designing cities, what was he all about? What did he stand for?
Well, part of what's cool about him, and I'm not an expert on him, but part of what's cool about him is that he's, a lot of people have thought that, well, you either be a good person or you're in the corporate world. But to him, it's through your business that you're able to be of service to others. And he really took the whole architecture thing seriously. And he also took Swedenborg's teachings about heaven, and that's right in the roads of Chicago. The whole way it's laid out is according to Swedenborg's model of heaven. So that went right into that very practical thing. And he believed very strongly that beauty should be accessible and connected with everyday life.
Yeah, so if you've ever been to Chicago, I'm sure you agree it feels like a little piece of heaven.
And there's a bunch of neat Daniel Burnham buildings right downtown there, and
And
he did buildings all over the world.
A statue of Swedenborg there in one of the parks, I think, in part because of that
That's
connection.
Right. That's
All
right.
right, hey, do you want to lead us into the next?
Oh, sure. Let's have a look.
Very good.
Who have we got? So basically, we've covered all the bases so far, like architect, right? So
Yeah. Is there anything we can add to this?
I was a pioneer businessman who introduced apple orchards to large parts of the United States.
Okay. Could be anyone.
Businessman, another businessman. Okay. I became an American legend while still alive.
So we're adding like a legend to
People describe me as eccentric, but also as kind and generous.
it. Okay.
I provided leadership in conservation, cared deeply about kindness toward animals, and cared deeply about leading a spiritual life. Who am I? Anybody get this one in the chat?
Okay.
Who am I? Here it comes. John Chapman, who may be better known to you as Johnny Appleseed.
Yes, that was a real guy. Johnny Appleseed.
That's really him. And here's a quote about him. John Chapman, better known as the folk hero Johnny Appleseed, was a devoted reader of Swedenborg. On his travels to the frontier regions of Ohio and Indiana, he would take parts of Swedenborg's books, which he would leave for people to read as a kind of circulating lending library. Chapter by chapter, he'd pull them out. People recall him referring to Swedenborg's writings as, quote, good news right fresh from heaven.
So here we have, again, we're touching a little bit on conservation, a little bit on business like we have before, but this is a genuine folk legend that you might have thought wasn't even a real person, but this really was based on this guy who went around and started these apple orchards. And also was a sort of a forward-thinking economic mind to know that people are moving west. They're going to need to have these things in place to make the kind of society that they want. But really, his lifestyle was his example of him seeing God's presence in nature, and also that service through occupation, that he was going out and doing something useful. But kindness, I remember seeing this piece about Johnny Appleseed as this interesting take on masculinity on the frontier early on.
Interesting.
Because he was like a frontiersman, which are generally tough and sort of ruthless, but he's being kind to all the animals and giving people food and stuff. So again, this sort of love to all flowing through him.
Apparently he had a great relationship with the Native Americans, got along with them just famously at times when people didn't, others didn't. But he had a good heart, and they could see that.
Since we're here in the conservation vein, and it just is fascinating to me because when I was younger, I studied biology and loved learning about ecology, so it's cool to see that so many important names in there were influenced. We do want to talk a little bit about John Muir. So he was the father of the national parks, he's been called that, started the Sierra Club, which was one of the first conservation organizations. And so when we were interviewing Devin, we happened to start talking about John Muir as well. So we want to give you a little clip from Devin about Swedenborg's influence on this wild man of nature.
And I'm mentioning Samson Reed, this, as Emerson calls him, my Swedenborgian druggist, because he was known for his homeopathic remedies. Because Emerson ends up giving this book to a young John Muir in Yosemite in 1871. And that's one way that there's a profound continuity between Emerson's sense of nature and the sort of spiritual semiotics of nature he gets from Swedenborg and other places goes right into Muir and the true dawn of sort of modern conservation, preservation, environmentalism at the end of the 19th century. Emerson amplifies a kind of idealist sense of nature on the one hand. On the other hand, his most famous disciple, Thoreau, who today in many ways sort of overshadows Emerson, Thoreau says he has no practical use for Swedenborg and doesn't seem to have really engaged substantially with Swedenborg himself. However, Thoreau does read and annotate and comment on a book by James John Garth Wilkinson, who's another important Swedenborgian in the 19th century, who had a book about Swedenborg's notion of the grand human or the grand man, and our connection to nature through language. And that ends up sort of catalyzing Thoreau in the 1850s around the drafting of Walden. So it's a little other tributary that goes into sort of the Thoreau-Walden movement, which today is so significant and important. With Muir, Muir encounters Swedenborg first through Emerson, in a sense. When Emerson comes to Yosemite as an old man, he's surrounded by a large entourage of glamorous politicians and other writers. And Muir, who's not famous at all at this point, is working in the valley at a lumber mill, and he begs Emerson to go spend a wild night with him out under a sequoia grove and really, mano a mano, encounter the beauty of wilderness and its spirituality together. Emerson declines, but a few weeks later, he sends him Samson Reed's Observations on the Growth of the Mind, this little Swedenborgian text from 1826. And when I began doing my research for my book about these topics, most of Muir's papers and writings are at the John Muir Archive in Stockton, California, at the University of the Pacific. And in the finding aid that I looked at, it said there was nothing of interest, no annotations to Muir's copies of Swedenborg books or the Samson Reed text. And when you do work out in the Muir Archive, it's a really groovy place to sit and read because it's also home to the Dave Brubeck Archive. And Dave Brubeck is the great jazz musician of the 20th century. So as you're sitting there in this space that has like Muir's furniture and his desk table and bookshelves, you hear this great jazz music the librarians and archivists have on in the background. So I'm enjoying the music, the books come out, and when I open Muir's copy of Samson Reed, the first thing I notice were all these beautiful, exquisite alpine flowers that Muir had pressed into the pages of the text. And then, in addition to a number of annotations and underlinings, in the margins at several places in the text, Muir had sketched these delicate filigree landscapes of the Sierra Nevada mountains, precisely in those places where Reed talks about a need to have a language of things, that correspondences in nature. Nature works like a sacred language. We need our poetry and our art to get more into the spiritual essence of things out there in the natural world. And there's Muir sort of drawing his spiritual landscape on the margin. So for me, it was like the smoking gun in the archive that proved here is a direct, profound response to Swedenborgian thought in Muir's writing. Muir also ends up getting 3 other books by or about Swedenborg in his library. And when you look at the way he reads those texts, it becomes pretty clear he's less interested in Swedenborg's theology per se and more in Swedenborg's mystical experiences, because Muir himself had on at least 3 separate occasions very uncanny experiences of prescient insight, inexplicable moments of telepathy where he felt he had to get off the mountain peak and go into the valley to see somebody, and then that person is strangely there. So he's very into those moments in Swedenborg's biography where there are similar moments of prescient insight or seemingly supernatural capabilities in nature. Muir's bestie is another Scotsman named William Keith, who also happens to be a Swedenborgian. And William Keith is a very preeminent landscape painter of the middle to late 19th century, who, after his first wife dies, sort of finds solace in Swedenborg's teachings about the afterlife. And a lot like the East Coast painter, William Keith, he tries to derive an aesthetic praxis and way of representing the spiritual essence of nature that comes from Swedenborg's writings. In a way, one could say the Sierra Club, which in many ways is the first modern environmental group that Muir and others helped found, begins in a Swedenborgian context because that group of mostly men who would get together to talk about their hiking in the Sierras would meet occasionally in William Keith's painting studio, where their walls were hung with these spiritualized landscape paintings of the mountains. So that helps germinate and generate the Sierra Club. Muir's first public debut as a speaker, he was very shy, reluctant to be any kind of public intellectual. And to calm himself, he had put beside his podium a large landscape by William Keith that he would look at as he talked. So Keith's role as an artist, as sort of a diffuser of Swedenborgian ideas, is part of the history of Muir's environmental thinking and environmental thought.
So a lot of fascinating stuff in there, but actually my favorite Muir-Swedenborg connection came in this little anecdote that Devin described shortly after that, so we'll just play you this tiny little clip.
One of the more puzzling places where you see Swedenborg in Muir's thinking, that's something I talk more about in my book because I've had fun playing around with it, is Muir has this very dramatic adventure with a dog on an Alaskan glacier that he writes about first in the 1890s, and then he publishes it as a longer little novella in the early 1900s. And he says it was the hardest thing he ever wrote, this narrative about his adventure with a dog. The dog's name was Stickeen. And in the draft notes for this text, which Muir begins to write out on the flyleaf of another book about dogs, Muir writes, Stickeen, a herald of a new gospel, a Swedenborg. So how is a dog like a Swedenborg? You know, there is some way that Muir's intense experience of this animal being, which seemed to have a personhood and personality, and it's a key moment for Muir's wilderness ethos in this tale about a dog. He parallels to his understanding of who Swedenborg was and is. So in a lot of ways, this hasn't really ever been addressed by environmental historians or people who look at the history of American environmental thought in Muir's work. And I'm not trying to make any kind of exclusive claim about it either. Muir was deeply influenced by William Wordsworth and other Romantic poets who had a spiritual sense of nature, but Swedenborg is certainly a key part of John Muir's sense of nature functioning like a spiritual language. That the mountains were, in his words, a kind of Bible that if you knew how to read the right way, it could reveal spiritual truth to you.
So I think what I take from that is that we all really have license to name our dog Swedenborg. Now, should we so choose. If you found Devin as fascinating as we did, he has a book coming out, which is going to be called A Language of Things, Emanuel Swedenborg and the American Environmental Imagination. It's not out yet, but as soon as it is, we'll have all kinds of Swedenborg Foundation links to it and everything. So check it out there. All right, let's see. So we spent a little time in environmental land.
All right, good.
Let's see what else we can dig up here. So our next, I don't want to say contestant, but our next unwilling participant is as follows. So I was we're getting back to Sweden finally here. A Swedish economist, writer, and Swedenborgian who is chiefly remembered for my pivotal role in the anti-slavery movement.
Really?
So here's social justice of the highest degree. After witnessing the full horrors and brutality of the slave trade, I began to work tirelessly for the abolition of slavery. All right, and we got one more. I wrote 2 hugely influential works on the matter, Observations on the Slave Trade and an essay on colonization, the latter becoming the key text for the economic and humanist arguments against slavery. So huge deal, and this person was, if you don't know already, Karl Bernhard Wadström. And this is a quote that we have for you regarding that. Wadström's campaigning against the slave trade was in part inspired by his Swedenborgian beliefs, and he was similarly influential in propagating the works of Emanuel Swedenborg, bringing many of his unpublished manuscripts over to Britain for publication and translation, and which we quote many of those manuscripts, and helping to fund and issue the first Swedenborgian periodical, the New Jerusalem magazine. So talk a little more about Wadström and what he was.
Yes, and I noticed that quote came from a conference that happened about Wadström recently that mentioned his connections with Swedenborg, and I believe there's a book that's forthcoming from the proceedings of that conference, which will be very cool to see.
Yes,
and
look for that next year.
Yeah, that's right, and I think part of the gist of that is this shocking idea that all people, all races have equal value and no race should be dominating over another. And I know in our best selves we're aspiring to that. We're still not doing terribly well in all areas with that now, but that was just a very kind of progressive idea at the time that he was saying that.
Yeah, and
he wasn't the only person, but he was very influential and leaderly and all that.
And certainly the Swedenborgian idea that the love of dominion is the root of all evil. And so to push back of not just trying to have your group on top. Certainly. Okay, well then let's...
That's right.
So there's a whole new base that we've covered.
Yeah.
And let's see if we can't just keep it rolling with this next one here. Would you want to
Swedish
read some
abolitionists. Okay.
Yeah, Swedish abolitionists. Check that one out.
Good. Okay, let's see. I was a well-known American novelist and journalist in the 1800s. Okay, another person from the 1800s.
The boom time.
I wrote the beloved poem Over the River and Through the Woods.
That rings some kind of bell. School for me or something.
That's right. And I championed abolitionism, there you have it again, women's rights, and Native American rights. Who am I? Who am I?
Anybody guess it?
Lydia Mariah Child. That's right. And I think we have a quote about her here. Oh no, this is from her selected letters.
Yeah.
All Swedenborg said seemed to me a direct revelation to his soul from the angels. His doctrinal correspondences seemed a golden key to unlock the massive gate between the external and the spiritual worlds. Yeah, she's got some writing ability there. I then experienced religion, she says, and for a long time lived in a mansion of glories. This concept of correspondences was first revealed to me in early life in the writings of Swedenborg. The subject took strong hold of my mind and has ever since deeply and vividly colored the whole fabric of my thought.
Amazing that for somebody who's working on abolitionism and women's rights and Native American rights, that correspondences would be so meaningful to
I know.
her. It seems like it's in a whole different field. So you have what Wadström was finding in the Swedenborgian idea is that you trying to control people and dominate over them is a major problem. But she extended that to gender rights as well as
that's right, and the Native American thing,
which is just like a natural extension of that. But she pushed out after that. But then also she was into this power of correspondence and symbolism, both in life but also in literature, and her using that in her work as well.
That's right, in her writing.
Yes.
And she was a very well-respected, some of these people have, they're not as well known now, but they were a very big deal in that time period.
They haven't had a #1 album in a while, but at their time, they were top in the charts, man.
That's right.
And Swedenborg was all through that. All right, so let's see who else we can add to this here. Next,
probably nobody.
Yeah, that's got to be the last one. I'm sure the people at home are saying, enough. I served as a judge on the Supreme Court of Illinois and served as vice president of the American Bar Association.
Really? Okay,
So
we haven't had a legal one until now.
That's exactly right. Next one, I made my mark on history as a principal organizer of the World Parliament of Religions, which began a new era of interreligious dialogue for the world. So you're bringing interfaith stuff into the spotlight. Okay, and then finally, my belief in the value of the World Parliament of Religions was deeply rooted in my Swedenborgian faith that every nation has some religion and that there are common essentials of all religions by which everyone may be saved. Those being quotes of Swedenborg there. So who am I? You may have heard of the Parliament. Did you know that it was started by Charles Carroll Bonney? And here's a little quote about Bonney, and I believe this is the one from his eulogy. So the person talking about him said, Mr. Bonney was a Christian. His Christianity was so truly Christian that it showed no narrowness, but meant universality, brotherhood, and charity. He sympathized with all searchers after the truth, and thus the non-Christian was to him not a pagan, but a brother and co-worker with whom he was glad to communicate and exchange thoughts, which was certainly a characteristic of Swedenborg's theology as well, right?
That's right. I mean, Swedenborg was, I think, groundbreaking in making these kind of statements, and Charles Bonney really picked up on that and made it concrete in this World Parliament of Religions. The idea that God provides a pathway, like all religions, as they say, all paths lead to the top of the mountain kind of thing, and they all work well, and that kindness, love, those kind of things, compassion, can unite people of different beliefs. And so he's, okay, let's do it. Let's come together in love and sit down. And now we're more used to that pluralism, but at the time it was just shocking to get those people in the same room talking to each other.
Groundbreaking stuff. All right, so there, and that's an important one. Interreligious dialogue is an important one to check off as well. Let's just see if we...
And he was from a legal, it's interesting, he was a judge and a lawyer, it's just interesting.
That type of mind would also be interested in Swedenborg, but he was. All right, so where else could we, haven't we been everywhere? Where else could we possibly go? Well, I think you're forgetting one area, and we're going to cover it right now.
Okay.
All right, so let's see, what do we got here, Jonathan?
Oh, okay. I was a Swiss psychiatrist, of course. Swiss psychiatrist who founded analytical psychology.
Oh, yeah.
Why not?
I've done that a couple times, founded analytical psychology.
I know. I had personal spiritual experiences, and I considered spiritual reality to be an important part of the science of psychology. People don't always mix those together.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So what's next?
I introduced ideas such as the collective unconscious, which people talk about a lot, archetypes as collective symbolism, synchronicity.
That's huge these days.
And the concept that growth toward our potential happens throughout our lives, not just in childhood.
So,
who am I?
Drum roll, please.
Drum roll. Who is it? Carl Jung.
Everybody knows that name.
That's
I would
pretty
think. I mean, that's
Jung
pretty far out there.
Jung and Freud, people talk about Jung a lot. That's right. And here's something that he said. I admire Swedenborg as a great scientist and a great mystic at the same time. His life and work have always been of great interest to me, and I read 7 fat volumes of his writings when I was a medical student.
So that's not quite just dabbling, 7 fat ones.
7 fat ones.
And there's actually a book written about Swedenborg and Jung by Brian O'Neill, and in that book, Brian talked about the similarities between major themes in Jung's work and Swedenborg's work.
Oh, interesting.
So, for example, you had in Jung the collective unconscious, which in Swedenborg is like this sort of spiritual world network that he describes influencing thoughts and feelings.
Right.
Jung's synchronicity that we talked about is a lot like the divine providence that Swedenborg goes on and on
that's
about.
That's right. Coincidences and right.
And then finally you have the symbolism and archetypes that are so powerful in Jung are a lot like, what's that word we love to use here? Correspondences. So there was a lot of connection there.
Yeah, that's right. And there had been an idea, basically, in the 18th century, people used to treat children as if they were just adults. I mean, you'd go to work at the age of 6 or whatever. They're just little adults. But to Jung to go in entirely the other direction, to say, hey, no, this is a development of lifelong potential, not just in childhood, but throughout your life. We're supposed to keep growing, and that idea of growth is huge to this day, isn't it?
Yeah, and in Swedenborg saying that you grow to eternity, that you're always developing, and just what you got going on now, just like an egg compared to what's coming on next.
Yeah, it's not just something until you're 20 or something, and then you're just the way you need to be.
And now for something completely different. Here's another area of life that Swedenborg influenced. Yeah, that's right. Do you want to take it away?
Oh, sure. As a couple, we endured many torturous years dealing with the effects of alcoholism.
Okay, this
it's a
one.
Couple.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
so this
different.
is 2 people. This is our first 2-personer.
We found solutions that involve faith in God and using one's painful experiences to help others.
Anybody in the chat? Okay, let's see the next one. I can't see them right now, so they're probably all getting it right. But
together we founded the AA movement and the Al-Anon movement.
You've probably heard of those movements.
Who are we?
None other than
Bill Wilson and Lois Wilson. That's right. Do we have a quote from these folks?
For sure. We
have something even better, don't we?
So when we were researching these, this particular connection needed a little more drawing out. It's a little more complicated. So as Karin, who was doing a lot of the research for this show, felt like, okay, I just need to piece this together and say it. So we have, for your viewing pleasure, a little clip of her explaining the Swedenborgian influence on both of these movements and organizations. So here's what she found.
People have noticed similarities between the 12-step program and the steps of repentance that Swedenborg writes about in his books. Lois was the granddaughter of a Swedenborgian minister, and she was religious, and so people have wondered, is there a connection? When I look into it, what I see is there isn't a direct connection between Swedenborg's books and the development of the 12 steps, but there certainly are indirect ones. I watched an interview on YouTube called Bill and Lois Tell Their Story. Also recommend a movie called When Love Is Not Enough about Lois Wilson. So Lois was religious, but Bill was not. He describes himself as scientifically trained and just didn't see any use for belief in God. So those Lois's Swedenborgian beliefs would have been in the background all the time. It does not seem that they were directly steering the development of the 12 steps. So Bill was an alcoholic. His condition was so bad, he had tried up many times to sober up, including in hospitals, and he was just facing the bleak inevitability of being committed to an asylum for the rest of his life. And then one day, a friend of his named Ebby visited him, an old drinking buddy who was now completely sober, and said that it was due to finding a belief in God and a religious practice. Ebby had become part of a Christian movement called the Oxford Group that recognized the need for personal change and then to help others from that experience of being changed. And Bill recognized Ebby's transformation and saw that it was real. He was completely sober, but couldn't fathom why a belief in God would have anything to do with it. Ebby also told a story about someone named Roland H., who was an alcoholic whose condition was so bad he went to Europe to meet with psychologist Carl Jung, who was very influenced by Swedenborg's books as well as by his own spiritual experiences. And Jung tried every treatment that was available in the medical world and psychology too at that time. And the only thing he had left to offer, because these weren't working for Roland, was that Roland would have to have a vital spiritual experience, not just church religion, but some spiritual experience that would change him. And so Ebby's story and Roland's story kind of ate away at Bill Wilson, and he couldn't deny that Ebby was cured. He couldn't shake that such a prominent psychologist would see value in spiritual experiences, but he just didn't know how to make himself believe in God. So he became severely depressed, checked himself into a hospital to get sober, as he had many times before, but just got more and more depressed to the point that he had never experienced before. True rock bottom. And then there in the hospital, he had this incredible spiritual experience that was completely life-changing. He had to work a bit to hang on to believing in that spiritual experience. And one thing that helped him was that his friend Ebby brought by a book called Varieties of Spiritual Experiences by William James, who was another prominent psychologist who was very influenced by the books of Emanuel Swedenborg. So where there were these threads in the story that helped Bill to stay, to affirm Bill in the reality of his spiritual experience, and that this belief in God, this religion path, did have validity. So Bill still had a lot of work ahead of him to develop his own way of hanging on to this sobriety and helping others. But he continued on there to develop the 12-step program. And Lois, though not an alcoholic herself, later found that she needed to apply the 12-step program to get past resentment. She had a tremendous amount of resentment build up from all the years that she had stuck by Bill and sacrificed so much and hung in there with love, and then he was just suddenly changed and going and meeting with other people, and she just felt purposeless and unappreciated. But she recognized, I need to get past this, just like Bill needed to get past alcoholism, and I need this 12-step program. And so out of that realization, she ended up developing Al-Anon, which was a program to help families of alcoholics and all that they deal with. So there were subtle influences from Swedenborg's books throughout that story. And though we continue to learn that cures for addictions have to involve both physical factors and spiritual factors, definitely in every process there are steps. And I'll end with a description from Swedenborg's book, Divine Providence, paragraph 36, about an angelic image of a palace with 12 steps. So I'll read here. Swedenborg writes, I have talked with angels about wisdom on occasion, and they have told me that wisdom is union with the Lord, because the Lord is wisdom itself. They have told me that they attain this union when they banish hell from themselves, and that the union is in direct proportionate to the banishment. They picture wisdom, they said, as a wonderfully elegant palace with 12 steps leading up to it. No one gets to the first step except with the Lord's help and by union with him. And for all of us, the ascent depends on that union. The higher we climb, the more clearly we realize that no one is wise on her or his own, but only from the Lord. We also realize that relative to what we do not know, that what we do know is like a droplet compared to a vast lake. The 12 steps to the palace of wisdom mean whatever is good united to what is true, and whatever is true united to what is good.
So sort of groundbreaking addiction treatment at a time when that really wasn't a thing also had all of these Swedenborgian tie-ins, as if that's an area of life that you wouldn't think, religious kind of stuff can get towards.
And I believe she was a relative of the Daniel Burnhams, the architect. I think her name was Lois Burnham Wilson.
It's all connected. So let's just see if we can't. We still got a little bit of time.
Okay.
Let's see if we can't squeeze a few more in here.
Okay.
Fill out our map of human life. So this next one, if you haven't guessed any right, maybe you'll get this one, because you can be Googling this stuff as we put these. That's what I would be doing.
They can do that?
I am known as the first Western convert to the Baha'i Faith, and I helped advance the organization of Baha'i communities in America. So, if you're into Baha'i history, I was named a disciple of Abdul Baha for my work in spreading the Baha'i Faith. No offense to how I pronounce that. Before becoming Baha'i, I was part of the Denver Swedenborgian Church. Hey, Denver! Swedenborg was an impactful stepping stone on my path to the Baha'i Faith. Who am I? And maybe he's watching this show right now. I don't know if he's still alive. We'll see. Who is he? If you get it, put it in the chat room. We're giving you a little bit of time. All right, Thornton Chase. Oh, 19. We just missed him. So this is what Thornton had to say. For 5 years, I studied Swedenborg daily and was a worker in the Swedenborgian Church. Although it is most beautiful and filled with wonderful truth, yet it does not contain all truth, as is now brought to us by the Baha'i Faith. Swedenborg was undoubtedly a divine philosopher, but he was not the culmination of the revelation of God. Although he was a forerunner thereof, Jesus was as Swedenborg depicted him. So mixed reviews of Swedenborg
That's
there.
right.
Maybe more the stepping stone that we talked about in the beginning, but he had some involvement there.
But a very influential person in yet another new religious,
That's right.
You've got Christians, you have, Buddhists, and it's all over the map.
Something in between there. All right. So what was he about?
Well, one of his things was the harmony of science and religion.
Okay.
Ever heard of that?
No, that's legit.
Yep. And you can Google this guy. You can learn a lot about this guy. And also, a theme that we've heard before is the unity of all religions in kindness and under one God. That this is really the same God that we're all worshiping. We may have different names. But
Awesome. And cool to get that little nod to the science and religion, because that was so much of a part of Swedenborg's mission.
Yeah,
as
that's
well.
right.
All right. This next one, I've got to admit, before this show, I had no idea there was a Swedenborg connection to this next person. So let's explore who they were. If you wouldn't mind doing these.
Oh, love to. I was the son of a poor Scottish immigrant, and as a young man, I attended a Swedenborgian church in Pittsburgh.
Okay, we're narrowing it down.
I worked hard and eventually formed a very successful steel company. When bought out, I became the world's wealthiest man.
Well, again, that could be anyone.
Yes, right. On principle, so lots of people.
All right, yeah.
I spent the latter part of my life giving away my wealth to worthy causes, establishing a pattern followed by later industrialists. Some call me the father of modern philanthropy.
Wow, so mover and a shaker, whoever this was, if you got it.
Rose up from poverty to become the world's wealthiest person.
And this like second act of giving away wealth to worthy causes.
Right.
Okay, let's check it out.
And now that's such a typical thing. Andrew Carnegie, yes.
Carnegie
you,
Hall.
You know Carnegie Mellon University,
Right.
and you still hear things that the Carnegie funds are sponsoring and so on. Here is a quote from Andrew Carnegie himself in a book titled The Gospel of Wealth. It is a nobler ideal that man should labor not for himself alone, but in and for a brotherhood of his fellows, realizing Swedenborg's idea of heaven, where, as he says, the angels derive their happiness not from laboring for self, but for each other.
I feel like he's one of the most famous rich people that is famous for being very wealthy. But to have him, I just didn't know he would just be name dropping Swedenborg like that.
Yeah.
And so, and you see, I think Swedenborg's principles had some influence there, because he talks about individual potential, and as Swedenborg does, the unique spiritual potential of each person. But there was this huge theme with Carnegie, which showed in the second half of his life's actions, that you're working not only for yourself but to serve others, as he said in that quote. And that Swedenborg says that is what life is. That is the state of heaven, is to say, what I'm doing here is for other people, and how do you turn your life into that? So pretty cool to think that Swedenborg had this impact on someone who's now called the father of philanthropy.
Yeah, and the fact that he's basing it on heaven, that's just really cool. Swedenborg's idea of heaven.
That's what I'm talking about. All right,
really neat.
Let's see if we can't expand. I always seem like this is going to be the farthest we can go, but I think we can squeak a couple more in there. I'd say 2 more. Before the end of the show. I'd say that's exactly what we researched.
Let's go for 2, but I don't know.
All right, let's see what this next one is. All right. I was a social reformer and linguist from Bombay.
Oh, of course. Right.
This is a new part of the map here. I wrote extensively on religion and social reform as an opponent of rituals and caste, while supporting widow remarriage and education for women. And finally, I founded hey, could you help me out with this? I just don't want to cause an international incident here.
Upayukta Yan Prasarak Sabha.
Like he said, a students' literary and scientific society. Okay, that's enough time to Google those words. Who am I? This was none other than Dadoba Pandurung.
That's right.
Okay. And this is a quote associated, and actually, he had such a cool quote that we've got it, quoting him at length here.
Yeah, here he is.
This is his book, A Hindu Gentleman's Reflections Respecting the Work of Swedenborg.
Hindu.
Yeah.
There you go.
It is in Asia, and particularly in India, I say, and ardently hope that the now tender plant of the doctrines of the new church, which would be Swedenborg's stuff, may find a peculiarly congenial soil. The science of correspondences.
There it is again.
Which correspondences are pretty hip, I guess. Everyone likes those. Which may be considered as a new discovery, is to my mind the best best suited to answer the intellectual demand of the age in which we live. It is, I must add, an admirable development of the theology of the Bible, peculiarly calculated to unite and assimilate it with the spirituality of all other religious systems, so as to...
Wow.
That's like high praise and like a key role that Swedenborg can play. Spiritual kernel, as one spiritual kernel or nucleus to attract and cluster around it, and thereby unite the whole human family into one brotherhood of spiritual faith and charity. Doesn't sound so bad. If this, my humble effort, should therefore appear in any measure to answer that purpose of extending the name and diffusing the wondrous religious doctrines of the illustrious Swedenborg all over the habitable part of our globe, sorry Antarctica, I should consider myself amply rewarded. Awesome statement. And so I wasn't familiar with him before, so do you want to just talk a little bit about what he was and what he did?
Yeah, I don't know much about him either, but that devotion to the value of all people, like that no caste system, so again, against the hierarchy. It's interesting that different people read Swedenborg and thought, hey, we should not have this hierarchical thing, the abolitionist movements, and now here's another one where, and the widow remarriage and espousing the rights of women was a big deal because you could be assigned to marry somebody when you're 8 years old, and if they die, then you're a widow for the rest of your life and you're not allowed to remarry. And so it's like, oh, come on,
right.
This kid's only 10 or 12, 14, and they've got a whole life ahead of them and everything. And again, that emphasis of connecting the religions through love, compassion, charity, service, use. It's really cool that you don't think of Hindu as necessarily having like a really strong affinity with this basically Christian-born philosophy of Swedenborg's, but there it is.
And he wasn't just a little enamored; he was fully enamored with Swedenborg's message, as you saw.
Publishing a whole book about it. Yeah,
that's right. All right, our very last one. Let's plant one more flag here. Would you be willing to read these last few questions? If you haven't one yet, this is going to be your one. I can feel it to you in the chat room.
I was an influential English poet of the Romantic period.
There we go.
Okay, that narrows it down. I used poetry to address issues of social oppression.
Here we go.
There's a theme. I read Swedenborg extensively and brought strong spiritual themes into my poetry.
It does seem like there's a really easy segue for people into art.
Yeah, I know,
like
it's interesting.
The ideas of Swedenborg are easily translatable into really good art, writing, all
I don't know that he ever targeted artists. He was trying to reach the nobles and the clergy and so on.
That's right.
All these artists picked up what he was doing.
Swedenborg is like, oh, suddenly I'm cool? I didn't think I was cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to give you a little time to answer. Let's see who it was.
Elizabeth Barrett Browning.
And what does she have to say?
She says, to my mind, the only light that has been cast on the other life is found in Swedenborg's philosophy. It explains much that was incomprehensible. And she was the one who wrote this beautiful poem, How Do I Love Thee? I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death.
And that amazingly touching line that she left with us here. And for her to say, the way for me to perceive the truth of the afterlife was Swedenborg. You see the hand directly in there.
That's right.
So there's
very cool.
There's actually a conference. There's a conference that featured her and a bunch of other artists, right? The Swedenborg in the Arts Conference that the Swedenborg Foundation took in hosting along with a couple of other organizations. So go to Swedenborg.com and you can see this conference and watch it if you're interested in following up more, if this was not enough people for you.
And I don't know if I can plug this in here, but the New Century Edition did an essay volume that talks about Swedenborg's influence. And so it's not exhaustive, but it gets into some other people, his relationship to vegetarianism and the freeing of the Russian serfs, millions of them, and just various different movements and things. The inventor of the the elevator, the inventor of the skyscraper, William Blake. There's other people who were. There's not an exhaustive list that you heard tonight.
And I got to say that what was the name of that volume?
Yes, it's called Scribe of Heaven.
Check it out.
And it's Essays for the New Century Edition about Swedenborg's life, work, and impact.
There's a free download on Swedenborg.com, and as a young reader of Swedenborg, that volume had an impact on me.
Did it?
Because it was the first time when I was familiar with Swedenborg's concepts, but to think about him in his context, it tells a little bit of what was going on around him during his life. It was awesome to me. It was an awesome, expanding thing. So definitely download that, Swedenborg.com, or order it. So the results are in. Thanks so much, Matt.
A mysterious.
Okay, so we've tried to keep track of who did what in trying to guess these people. So I guess we first have a list of like who got it first. All right. So for Ralph Waldo Emerson, the prize goes to Will Linden. Then D.T. Suzuki, that was Yokopo. Helen Keller, Mr. Binker's the cat. We're just shouting everyone out who like took the time to watch this whole show. Daniel Burnham, that was John Childs. Hi, Dad. How are you? John Chapman, that was Matthew Bush. Carl Bernard Wadstrom and Lydia Marie Child, doesn't look like. And Charles Carroll Bonney, nobody could quite pick those up, which is total. If I was in your position, I would have a goose egg for sure,
right.
Except for Helen Keller. Carl Jung, that was Matthew Bush. Bill and Lois Wilson, that was Joshua Anderson.
Good.
Nobody got Thornton Chase. That's fine. Andrew Carnegie, Robert T. Rhode got that one. Oh, nice.
That's great.
Deborah Pandurung, nobody. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Eternal Spring got that one.
Oh.
And do you want to read our winners
look at
list?
the rankings.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 12 is top?
Yeah.
Right. So Eternal Spring is the winner of all time. I don't know what you win, but that's
not that it's a competition, but
really well done.
You win gratitude from us. Like, thanks everybody for humoring us and participating in this meeting.
With 12 points, Matthew Bush was at 11 points. Mr. Binker's the cat with 9. Yokopo with 7. Robert Rhode with 7. Will Linden 5. John Childs 5. Joshua Anderson 5. David Higgins 2. Preliminal 2. Herbert Edgar Wyndham got 1. Gaffogim 1. Carl Godlove 1.
Thanks, everybody. So this has been a slightly silly program, but I feel like it's got a serious soul behind it, because to me it matters. If I'm going to feel like this is deep truth in Swedenborg, this really means something, this really does something, to see that it's actually reached out and touched the world in real ways, that brings it out of it's this box that's locked inside a vault somewhere, to know this has been changing the culture, this has been touching a lot of minds and hearts, and good can come out of this.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not just, I mean, we didn't deal with composers like Richard Yardumian, or there are people all in all different kinds of walks of life that have picked up on this. So some things you'll get sort of a cult group will sort of, we love that, and that's cool, that's great. But this was very broad.
Yes.
It's not widely recognized. The name didn't survive. The tag didn't stay on all the time. But these ideas, the idea of like, hey, slavery's bad, or that the religions really can come together over love and compassion and things like that. These are very important ideas. Even that idea from Elizabeth Barrett Browning about love surviving death and so on.
Well, the fact that the tag didn't stay on is a testament, I think, to the validity of the ideas, because if the only way that Swedenborg's concepts can influence the world is in things that are expressly Swedenborgian, then are they really anything but just tag holders? But the fact that somebody can read Swedenborg and go do something that helps the world, but people wouldn't even know the connection, that shows there's some real, there's real potency, and it's just talking about the actual levers that move life.
There's fuel in there that people have used to do significant good in the world.
Check if you may be saying, okay, let's get to next week's show. But if you're fired up about this, check the description. There's links to the Swedenborg Foundation's books and articles about Swedenborg's influence. They're all over there. Please like and subscribe. Even if you'd really hated everything we've ever done, just do it. And we're a nonprofit, so the only way we can do important stuff like this, enough self-deprecating humor, is through Patreon. I mean, not just Patreon, but any donation to support. Patreon is a great way to give a little bit monthly and provide us with a sustainable funding source so that we know we can produce content on a regular basis. We also give you little thank yous in the form of silly behind-the-scenes videos and extra stuff for if you just can't quite get enough. It's just a token of our appreciation to you for doing that. So thanks to everyone who's on there. We'll see you soon with the next video. And to everybody, we'll be back next week.
Oh, what are we talking about?
We're going to be talking about spiritual bodies.
Hey, that's cool.
The complex arrangement of different forms that make us human and make us able to progress to eternity.
Whoa.
How could you not want to do that? We'll see you next week. Thanks so much for hanging out.
Swedenborg and Life Live is Curtis Childs, host and showrunner, with co-host Jonathan Rose. Live stream tech and graphics by Stuart Farmer and Matthew Childs. Show writing and chat moderation by Karin Childs and Chelsea Odner.